As you may have seen from the announcement, gentlemen, the A.Yuzu and Eimi banners are arriving soon. Now, should you pull for them? It is honestly quite difficult to say whether you should pull or not. Previously, I recommended pulling for A.Yuzu. A.Yuzu is expected to be a versatile supporter with broad utility across various content, while Eimi serves as a secondary DPS core for Drumbaka, particularly for lunatic and more comfortable torment clears. But first, let us talk about what they actually do. A.Yuzu is a special support who can apply X skill cost reduction to an ally for 3x skill uses, while also increasing that ally's attack by a decent amount. Looking at the duration of her attack buff, it is admittedly quite short compared to other attack buffers available. However, what makes it good is that the attack buff only activates alongside the ally's X skill. So, the attack buff does not activate immediately, it only triggers when the ally affected by A.Yuzu's X skill actually uses their X skill. This means you can use A.Yuzu's X skill immediately, then simply wait until your DPS has enough buff and X cost before activating it for an instant burst. Her X skill costs 4, which is fairly reasonable considering we already have students who perform similar roles with lower X skill costs with different applications. Her basic skill deals damage to enemies while reducing their critical rate. It sounds decent on paper, although I am not entirely sure how impactful this debuff actually is, compared to more helpful debuffs like defense reduction or critical damage resistance reduction. Her enhanced skill is, honestly, not very impressive, even at enhanced skill plus. Both versions simply increase her own attack. Considering she is a support unit, she is not exactly contributing meaningful damage anyway. Her sub-skill increases allies' attack, which is perfectly fine. Overall, she looks like a fairly decent supporter, although the only skills that truly stand out to me are her X skill and sub-skill. At first glance, she certainly looks worth pulling if you lack X skill cost reduction supports such as Seiya or NY Fuka. A.Yuzu even provides 3 separate cost reductions, making her an excellent partner for students like A.Yuzu, A. Hoshino, and S. Mika. But is she actually worth pulling? Well, let us split this into a few scenarios. If you are a casual player who only aims to clear torment or lower difficulties, then she can safely be skipped if you already own Nagisa, not enough Pyrex to spark, and she is not your waifu. If you do not have Nagisa however, then A.Yuzu becomes much more valuable for helping tame the rather expensive X skill costs of A.Yuzu, A. Hoshino, and S. Mika over 3 uses. Let us put it this way, if you want to borrow a highly invested, niche DPS build from one of your friends, then you will naturally use your borrow slot for that DPS instead. In that situation, bringing A.Yuzu as supporter becomes a perfectly reasonable choice because of that. So, in my opinion, A.Yuzu is indeed worth pulling if you plan to use your borrow slot for a highly invested DPS specialized for a particular raid boss, especially if your own roster lacks the necessary second main DPS. If you do not have enough Pyrex however, there is nothing to worry about. A.Yuzu's role can generally be covered by using Nagisa as an alternative. On the other hand, if you do not have Nagisa either, then A.Yuzu becomes the replacement and is well worth considering. Then again, you might be wondering, why not just use both? Well, because the remaining special slot is usually reserved for Kisaki, or another supporter that increases X skill cost recovery such as Dimichiru, or even better, Ryo. From a competitive or meta perspective, I would say A.Yuzu will likely become a valuable backup supporter for future lunatic clears. She may very well be worth obtaining depending on how future content develops. However, if you are low on Pyrex, skipping her should be perfectly acceptable since Nagisa can fulfill a similar role already. At the end of the day, you are mostly pulling her either for competitive reasons, or simply because she is your waifu, and you have enough Pyrex to spark her, and you don't have Nagisa. Now, moving on to the other banner, Eimi is an explosive DPS whose X skill enters precision mode and applying a mark to the selected target. Once marked, Eimi will prioritize attacking that enemy above everything else. To be completely honest, I do not own her myself, so I cannot confidently judge just how strong she actually is. The real reason I skipped her is much simpler. She is tall. She has gigantic milk. Unfortunately, that is simply not my preference. However, we actually have a much cheaper alternative with a very similar kit. Her name is A.Yuzu. The difference between the two is that Eimi converts attack speed buffs into increased basic attack and basic skill damaged out, whereas A.Yuzu converts X skill damage buffs into increased basic attack and basic skill damaged out. The concepts are almost identical. Eimi simply performs better. Well, I suppose that is just one of the benefits of being a gacha unit. The place where Eimi truly shines is against Drumbaka, the new raid boss introduced on the JP server. Although she is undoubtedly excellent there, owning her is not required for torment or lower difficulties. Instead, you can simply embrace the true Blue Archive experience, that is the crit mold. A.Yuzu, who should arrive roughly 2 months after Eimi's banner, serves as the budget alternative. She is fully capable of clearing Drumbaka torment or lower. However, lunatic difficulty is an entirely different story, where Eimi becomes much closer to being a requirement. So, Eimi offers the easiest and most consistent way to clear Drumbaka for lunatic. A.Yuzu meanwhile, is the budget solution, but she requires a tremendous amount of crit mold to achieve similar results. That said, this certainly does not stop people from using her. In fact, the majority of players still choose A.Yuzu for clearing torment and lower difficulties, simply because she gets the job done. So, as for A.Yuzu, I personally think she is worth pulling. If a particular raid comes along, and I do not have the appropriate DPS for it, I can simply use my borrow slot for a highly invested main DPS, while letting A.Yuzu provide the necessary support. This is especially newer players who do not have S-Nagisa. A.Yuzu can be extremely valuable for managing the expensive X skill costs of students such as A.Yuzu, A. Hoshino, and S. Mika. However, if you do not have enough Pyrex to spark her, or you already have other banner priorities, that is perfectly fine. You can simply save for future banners and hope she eventually appears as an off-rate spook during your future pulls. That remains uncertain. But what is certain is that you can simply use S-Nagisa as an alternative, and she actually performs quite well, arguably even better in some situations, although she is a bit trickier to use. Or rather, A.Yuzu serves as an alternative solution for players who do not have S-Nagisa. Meanwhile, Eimi truly shines against Drumbaka on lunatic difficulties, as her overall damage output is significantly better than A.Yuzu, who serves as the budget alternative. She is also practically a must-have if you are aiming to clear lunatic, thanks to her light armor, which makes her considerably more durable than A.Yuzu in that fight. However, for Drumbaka torment or lower difficulties, A.Yuzu is more than capable of getting the job done. The current banner is also an easy skip, and most of the featured students are generally not worth building, except for Eimi perhaps. She is a solid special repositioning unit that can serve as an alternative for players who skip Tyuka due to Pyrex concerns, especially if they wanted to save enough for both or even the quadruple fest banners. So, if you happen to have Eimi, you can simply use her instead, though I am not entirely sure how well that actually works, as I have never personally used Eimi myself. As for their builds, for A.Yuzu, you can simply raise her to the maximum level while keeping her at a minimum of 4 stars. Ideally, 5 stars or UE30 is a recommended stopping point, as anything beyond that does not provide any significant benefit. For her gear, maximizing the first and second slots should be sufficient. As for the third slot, the high tier watch should be prioritized for your main DPS instead. Otherwise, upgrading her watch does not provide any meaningful benefit. Regarding her skill levels, prioritize maximizing her X skill and sub skill. Her basic skill and enhanced skill offer very little value since she is primarily a support unit. The main reason you bring her is for her X skill cost reduction and attack buff to support your DPS. As for Eimi, she requires a high level of investment. Aim for at least UE40, or 5 stars with 2 weapon stars unlocked, while fully maximizing her level, skills, and gear. She needs this level of investment to perform well against the Drumbaka raid, especially on lunatic difficulty. If you are not interested in lunatic, and only plan to clear Torment or lower, then simply use Otogi instead. And farm as many of her elves as possible once her event becomes available. If you happen to own Eimi as an alternative to Tyuka, then a budget investment is more than enough. Simply maximize her hairpin and necklace, and she will perform perfectly well in her intended role, and that should be all. As always, Godspeed.